Hello and welcome to Shorts in Psychology. In this video, we're going to look at how to write a qualitative investigation report and its different components. A quick note before we get started. This guide is for SACE Psychology, which is the South Australian curriculum. Expectations for a qualitative report and other psychology courses may vary. Let's quickly define what qualitative data is and how it's collected first. Qualitative data is information about the qualities or characteristics of what is being studied. It can be collected in a wide variety of ways, including as images, descriptions of behaviour observed and recorded by the researcher, or verbal statements made by participants. Verbal statements are either collected in writing using a survey or questionnaire, or can be collected orally via methods including interviews or focus groups. For more information on some of the qualitative data collection methods, check out my videos on focus groups and the Delphi technique, which are linked in the description below. Let's now go through the qualitative data analysis process. After collecting qualitative data via your chosen technique, it needs to be analysed via content analysis. This is how the data is simplified and coded into a series of themes, which are then tracked and their frequency calculated. The results of content analysis are then summarised in a frequency table, after which you analyse and interpret it. This involves summarising patterns in the data and interpreting it where you give it meaning using psychological concepts and research literature. You also need to evaluate your data and the procedures used and draw conclusions. So what are the main differences between a quantitative and qualitative report? Firstly, quantitative reports are written following the conducting of an experiment or observational design, both of which involve testing whether one variable, the independent variable, influences or causes a change in another variable, the dependent variable. In the case of an experiment, the independent variable is deliberately manipulated by the researcher, whereas in an observational design, the independent variable changes naturally. In both instances, however, the aim is to identify causal processes and involves hypothesis testing. In contrast, a qualitative investigation aims to get an in-depth understanding of individuals' experience within their natural environment. This is a more descriptive type of research, which is useful when very little is known about phenomena. Rather than hypothesis testing, it involves exploring a general research question. How data is analysed and represented also varies for these two report types. For quantitative data, statistical analysis is used, such as calculating the mean, median, and standard deviation. Thus, data is represented in tabular and graphical form. Qualitative data is analysed via content analysis and summarised in frequency tables. Any psychology investigation report needs to have these 6 sections. Note that the report has the same basic sections and word limit, regardless of whether it is a quantitative or qualitative report. What varies is the content within some of these sections. A reminder too that the materials, method and results section aren't included in the word count. Let's take a closer look at each of these sections for a qualitative report. The introduction explains why you are undertaking the investigation and incorporates your aim and your rationale. What is the science you are trying to investigate? What knowledge or theory are you representing by doing the investigation? You may want to include some relevant previous research for context. Just make sure it's referenced. State your aim. What are you trying to find out? Rather than testing a hypothesis, qualitative investigations have a general research question that is being explored, so this needs to be stated. What, how, and or why are you trying to explain? Introduce that here. You also need to identify your sample and population, design type, which is qualitative, and briefly explain how data was used to answer the question. Were focus groups conducted? Briefly explain what this involved. Let's have a look at an exemplar of an introduction for a qualitative report. This introduction is a very clear and concise overview of the context for the investigation. As well as containing all of the required specific information about the investigation, including its aim and the general research question being explored. This student has also mentioned how the focus group method was used to collect data and from what sample group. They then finish with a brief summary of how the data was analysed. Again, keep it brief, as you will provide more detail of this in the materials and method section. You won't have many materials to list for a qualitative investigation. However, it is important to include a list of the focus group questions discussed or the open-ended questionnaire used in a figure with a descriptive heading. Technically, the reader should be able to replicate your investigation exactly, so they need a copy of your questions and/or the images used. The purpose of the method section is to summarise how the data was collected. Again, the reader should be able to reproduce your method, so it needs to be detailed and specific. If focus groups were conducted, you need to describe the role of the facilitator and any note takers or observers. How are the responses recorded during the focus group? Here is an example of what that could look like. You then need to explain how content analysis was used to summarize the data. This example illustrates how concise this can be. For more detail on how to conduct content analysis, watch my video describing the process that is linked in the description below. I will mention a couple of important reminders about content analysis before we move on to the results section. Don't have too many themes. Your word limit is tight, and the more themes you have, the more you have to summarize and discuss in your analysis. So try to limit it to a maximum of 4 or 5 themes per question. Make sure these themes are also specific and descriptive. You don't want them to be too vague, as your themes then won't be really capturing or describing what the responses discussed. Lastly, you don't need to analyse and discuss all of the focus questions that were asked in the results and discussion sections. Again, word count is tight, so choose 1 or 2 that most relate to your research question that you can talk about. The results section should only contain process data, so this means your frequency table or tables. There should be no raw data in the form of transcripts. Have 1 frequency table per focus group question, where each frequency table contains the following: a descriptive figure heading and the focus group question posed as the title. The table itself should have 3 columns: themes, illustrative examples, and frequency. It should also have a total responses row at the bottom. Let's see what that looks like. You can see that this frequency table has a nice descriptive figure heading. The reader should understand exactly what data they are looking at from your results section without having to read the method section. The focus group question the data relates to is also shown at the top of the table, and the data is clearly and logically organised into a series of descriptive themes. The total number of responses are displayed at the bottom. Let's compare this frequency table to a less successful exemplar to illustrate some do's and don'ts of frequency tables. The first reminder is to only have a few illustrative examples. Don't just list all of the recorded comments that fit into this theme in the illustrative comments column. Another important reminder is to make sure themes are specific and descriptive. Some examples here include detriments to health and pleasure of the experience. In comparison, the theme shown here is very vague. The theme of family is too broad to provide a good sense of what sort of responses the participants provided, and we can see from the illustrative comments that there are indeed a variety of sub-themes here. Some of the comments are referring to money, some to gender roles and family responsibilities. Just reading the theme of family doesn't tell us this, and it has necessitated the student having to include all of the responses as illustrative comments. Okay, you've analysed your data, and now you have to talk about it and discuss what it means. For an investigation where there has been a discussion of a single question, discuss each theme separately. Start by discussing the theme's frequency, both as a total number of responses and percentage of participants is ideal. You then need to explore some of the main ideas that were discussed in relation to this theme and why participants may have responded this way. Make sure you link your interpretation to psychological concepts and reference material where appropriate. For investigations where there has been a discussion of multiple questions, you want to follow a similar structure, just making sure you discuss each question as a separate paragraph. For each question, summarise the pattern in results in terms of the most to least frequent theme and discuss some of the main ideas raised. As for a single question, you need to interpret your results, suggesting possible explanations for why participants may have responded this way, linked to psychological concepts and reference material. This excerpt is a great example of a qualitative report discussion. Pause the video if you want to have a read through of the students' response, as I'm just going to explain what they have done well. The student starts by discussing the theme's frequency and then goes into detail about some of the main ideas that were discussed within this theme, including illustrative comments to support their conclusions. They then effectively link this to psychological concepts and research literature. This exemplar is also a great demonstration of how you can do this concisely. Saying more doesn't equal more depth and meaning. Often it has the opposite effect and actually reduces clarity. In this section, you need to evaluate the procedures and their effect on the data, just as for a quantitative report. Are there any limitations to the data or sample used? Evaluate the sample's size and representativeness, including any types of bias present in the sample and how this may have influenced the data. Make sure you link your discussion of the sample to external validity. You also need to identify any sources of uncertainty in the data that reduce its quality. What extraneous variables may have been present and how may these have influenced the data? Link your discussion here to internal validity. Other things to consider when discussing the internal validity of the results include whether your focus group questions measure what you wanted them to measure and whether the qualitative design and the questions used were the most appropriate measure. The next aspect to evaluate is the reliability of the results. Would measures vary if circumstances were changed? Would the results be the same if repeated under similar conditions? Lastly, discuss any relevant ethical considerations about collecting and/or using this data and reaching conclusions from it. Throughout your evaluation, it is also important to suggest improvements to the investigation in terms of the procedure and the sample. The final section is the conclusion. This must be supported by evidence and should be based on results that can be repeated. It should be a simple statement of findings of the investigation which answers the aim. Recognise the limitations of the conclusion, explaining why the results of some investigations may not lead to definitive conclusions. You may wish to start it with a phrase such as, "It was found that." Thanks for listening. Hopefully this has clarified how to write a qualitative investigation report for SACE Psychology. Feel free to post any questions you have below. Otherwise, I'll see you next time for another Shorts in Psychology.